best practice. So call super init. Odds are nothing's going to go wrong. Maybe something will go wrong, but odds are nothing will go wrong. But again, to be extra rigorous, make sure that it returns non-nil value. And so assuming it's OK, go ahead and set self.age equals age, self.name equals name, and then return self. Now, I could have copied and pasted this code up here, but this is probably better design in that I'm reusing my own code by calling one init method, the more explicit one, from the more generic of the two. But this is not even strictly necessary. If I'm OK with having nameless, ageless students, then I just don't implement that default init method at all. And so this init method is similar to what feature of PHP, what feature of Java? It's the constructor. So new is like alloc, and these init methods are like the actual constructor functions, or methods rather. All right, so here's the new feature where we left off last time. So this is a main.m in version 7 of the student class. And notice that I again have the prototype for this greet method up top. And I again have my main method here. I again use auto release pool. For now, let's just assume that that makes some magical memory management happen for me. But we'll come back and peel that layer away before long. But here's the new thing that we only touched on briefly last time. If you want an array in Objective-C, you can use NS mutable array or NS array. And the difference is as their name suggests. NS mutable array means it's changeable. You can add to it, subtract from it, and the like. NS array is immutable. Popular CS word for just means unchanging. Once you create it, that's it. So what was our answer last time to the question of why would you want a mutable versus immutable? In C, we always had mutable arrays. Yeah? Performance. There's just some optimizations you can do. If you know the array is never going to change, you don't need extra code, you don't need boundary checks or anything because it's not going to change. And so a NS array is good when it's static data or data whose length is known in advance. A mutable array, though, is necessary if you just don't know or if you want to demonstrate mutable arrays. So in this case, common paradigm. And just to be sure, you guys in back, you can read this font size OK? OK. So NS mutable array star students, this is CS50 stuff, like declare a pointer called students of type NS mutable array. The right-hand side is the new stuff, but we've seen it a couple times now. NS mutable array is the name of a class. Alloc is a class method, which means we can get away with calling it without instantiating an object yet. And that's good, because otherwise we'd have a little catch-22 here if the goal is to allocate an object. And then init, which is very commonly just put in this nested form so that you're calling alloc, then init immediately. Much like in other languages, you would call new and then the constructor. And what do I get back? I get back, hopefully, the address of an actual NS mutable array object. Now, if I were being really rigorous, I would check return values here and the like. But for now, it's actually OK, especially since nil, as we'll see. You can still call methods on nil without things crashing. But more on that when we talk more about memory. So now, just some methods. Students is now a mutable array. I'm going to call an add object method and pass it what? Well, I'm going to dynamically allocate a student object, immediately initialize it to Alice, whose age is 20. And that's what I'm going to put first into the array. Add object, if we read the documentation, appends it to the end of the array. So Alice just went at location 0. And the method called add object handled that for me. Now, just to be anal about jargon, I keep saying method because it's the more familiar terminology. But technically what we're doing here is we are passing an add object message to the object called students. But functionally, these are the same ideas. But you'll see both types of jargon. Yeah, Zach? Okay.
I can imagine that eventually you'd have an init method that had a lot of things that you'd be passing in. Is that just get really long?
Good question. When you start having many, many, many parameters, what happens? Yes, it does get very long. What you'll see is Xcode will actually start automatically indenting your code so that all of the parameters line up key value by centering them on the colon. So if you're familiar with LaTeX, it's like lining things up with the equal sign. So it's actually nice in that sense. Order still matters, but at least formatting is not such a big deal. All right, so next, Bob, uninteresting. We do the same thing, give him a different name and a different age. And this is just what we call fast enumeration. PHP has this, Java has this now. For each, this is like the for each construct. On each element in students, temporarily assign it the pointer s, and then do something with s. In this case, I'm calling greet, whose sole purpose in life is just to print Bob or Alice's name. So the only takeaways here, again, are the introduction of this collection class, NSMutableArray, the syntax for calling this. But it's not really new syntax. It's just getting a little more complex aesthetically, because we're nesting and using assignments and the like. Any questions on any of this thus far? And again, honestly, please speak up now so that you don't feel lost. OK, not lost. Excellent. So let me go ahead and pull up version 8 of this here. So version 8, I think I have to stop numbering these and come up with more exciting names, because it just feels like a huge long list otherwise. But this one's easy. So this is just an example of demonstrating immutable arrays in the scenario where you know what the list is already. For marginal performance benefits, you just want to hard code that list. And so in this case, I didn't even bother creating a student class, because I just wanted to store strings in this case. So now notice here, I create an NSArray pointer called names. Then I call NSArray array with objects. And apparently, and this is funky syntax now, if you want to pass in multiple values for a single parameter, can't usually do this, you simply separate them via commas. So this is going to create an immutable array whose objects are Alice, quote unquote, at location 0, Bob, quote unquote, at location 1, and essentially the null terminator, really the nil terminator at location 2. And so now we have an array of fixed size 2. So what am I not calling in this line of code that I have been calling up until now on every class? Alloc. So there's no mention of alloc, and yet this has got to be somehow dynamically allocated, right? So it turns out that a very common paradigm in Objective-C also is what are called convenience methods. A convenience method is one that is named pretty much consistently with what it does. In this case, array with objects. Give me an array with objects. Now to do that service for you, it has to call alloc for you. So these convenience methods are plus methods. They're class methods. They call alloc for you. So why is this useful? Why this sudden new feature here? Go with the obvious. What is your gut tell you? What's that?
We don't need to call alloc.
That's it. You don't have to call alloc yourself. It's a convenient method in that it's convenient. It really is as simple as that. It just avoids this increasingly annoying paradigm of calling alloc init. Alloc init, you just say array with objects, and then you can tell it what you want to allocate and initialize simultaneously. So someone had to write array with objects, but it is another example of a class method that's a little more interesting than just alloc itself. Yeah?
So the array with objects, it doesn't have to have like the same type of objects?
No, it does not need to have the same types. So this is unlike a lot of languages. And in this case, we can put whatever we want in this case. Now, it's often bad design to put strings and strings and other objects, student objects, all commingled, unless they all descend from some parent class, which then conceptually makes sense. But yes, you could do that. Yeah?
Before reference counting, we have to create ourselves?
Before reference counting, you would not have to free this, because this would be added to what's called the auto-release pool by having passed an auto-release message. So that detail, though, is now swept under the rug. But we'll come back to that and lift the rug in a couple weeks. Yeah, Zach?
And the array with objects is reserved for immutable arrays.
In this case, so this is one of these RTFM things. Like if the documentation says that there is this convenience method for the NSArray, it exists. And I believe it does also exist for NSMutableArray.
So we could have done that in the last.
Could have, yes, exactly. Only because someone wrote it that way and we confirmed as much in the documentation. Doesn't necessarily have anything to do with mutability. Yeah?
You need to give it nil to tell it how many objects are in it?
Yeah, this is kind of unfortunate. You have to say nil at the end of a statically allocated array in this fashion. So yes, it is necessary. And so just to familiarize again with some documentation, in Xcode, you can typically go to Window, Organizer, and then there's a whole bunch of stuff here, among which is documentation. All Apple did, they're kind of cutting corners now. This just links to a web page. Frankly, it's a little easier sometimes. If I just pull up a browser, search for NSArray, you'll almost always get it as the top hit or so. This will dive you in deep to the documentation. And now let's just expose a few things. So on the left-hand side, there's a little table of contents. Class methods, instant methods, constants, tasks. These all relate to functionality we've been talking about thus far. Notice on the right-hand side, it tells us the hierarchy. So NSArray descends from NSObject. So that's good. It's consistent with our story thus far. Conforms to, what feature of Objective-C is this list apparently referring to? Protocols. So NS copying is one. Turns out there's a whole bunch of others. NS fast enumeration. The fact that I could do that clever little one-line for loop is because it adheres to that protocol there. So again, this is a way of, you don't want to have a whole hierarchy of things just so that they share functionality. This is sort of like laterally, horizontally sharing functionality. So protocols let us do that. But now let me just go and say, what do we want here? So recall that the method a moment ago was array with objects. So let me search for that. And indeed, under the creating an array subsection here, which is just categorizing things, I can call array with objects. And now, OK, I get some sample usage. And I can now read the docs here and use this particular method. If I go back, though, notice there was one other mention here. If I search for this again, array with objects count, I could actually hard code the length so that I can avoid passing in what? Nil. So there's a way around that. And you'll find that much like PHP, Objective-C or iOS has sort of the kitchen sink of functionality where you might have dozens, maybe even 100 methods associated with a function, with an object. These are the sorts of things that you should never try memorizing or absorbing all of this. It's more of a Control F when you want to find something, or Google to see what a class exposes. Yeah, Aaron. Is there multiple inheritance? That's a good question. I don't think so. That's my secret glance at Tommy. I don't think so. No. That tends to create some issues. And so usually mix-ins or the equivalent or protocols help address that. All right. All right. So let's add one or two other things. And then we'll break and look at GUI stuff after. All right. So here we introduce one other little thing, which is, let's see. So here's my own convenience method. So this is my student.h. This is now version 9, only one to go. In version 9, in my header file, student.h, notice that I've not only declared init with name, but I've also declared student with name. So student with name is again named in a manner consistent with the idea of convenience methods. The convention is almost always, if the purpose of this class is to return a student or an array, call the convenience method student or array with something so that it sort of does what it says. Notice the plus is important. The ID is important so that it returns a pointer of some sort. And in the M file, here's what I actually do. I take care of the alloc by calling student alloc, then calling my own method init with name and age, which we had before. So otherwise, example 9 is quite like 8. But I've added or stolen this idea of a convenience method from the array class. And lastly, in version 10, we now have this capability. In version 10, I finally realized, you know what, this is stupid. I have declared this prototype atop my file for greet in like 9 previous examples, just so that I could pass in a student and then have that function greet say hello Bob or hello Alice. This is a perfect opportunity to just put this functionality inside the class itself so that I can literally send a message to the object and say, tell me your name. And then the object will say Alice or Bob. So this is a perfect example of a good opportunity for encapsulation. What I really want to do is this: Alice greet, Bob greet, and that message that I send should trigger the printing, the saying of Alice's or Bob's name. So how to implement this? Well, in student.h, I simply have to promise to implement an instance method that returns void. It's just going to use nslog, which is not useful in the real world, but for today it's useful. Greet doesn't take any arguments. And then what am I going to do? Well, the only trickery is in accessing the object's name, but this too is relatively straightforward. In my .m file, I copy the method's signature. I call nslog, hello, I am such and such, I am d years old, and then over here, I simply pass in the name of the instance variable and for age and for name. Alternatively, I could have written this in slightly different form. How else could I have expressed give me your name, give me your age in this comma-separated list of placeholders? Could say self.name, self.age. Which is better? Kind of depends. So on the one hand, it would be it's better to do it this way with the instance variables. Why, do you think? What's that? Yeah. You avoid a method call, right? I don't know how expensive a method call is, but it's got to be more expensive than just going directly to the memory location and getting the address. So that might be a plus, especially if we're calling greet in a tight loop all day long. A downside, though, of this approach is what? In other words, why might we instead want to go with self.name or self.age or even self-space age and self-space name as in this syntax here? Yeah, Zach.
If you wanted to have some additional functionality when you call something.
Exactly. Maybe there's some error checking code in there that's super important to make sure it gets called so that I don't accidentally say, hi, I'm quote unquote. I at least wanted to say, hi, I'm John or something silly like